$2 million. That's what two men paid for a company that every serious investor, every major television network, and every sports executive in America had already written off as dead. A company so radioactive that U.S. senators had publicly tried to ban it. A company that couldn't get a cable deal, couldn't get a sponsor, and couldn't even legally operate in most American states. $2 million for something nobody wanted. And in a few minutes, I'll show you exactly what that $2 million bet became, and why the number will genuinely shock you. But here's the thing. This isn't a story about fighting. It was never about fighting. This is a story about control. About who owns the platform, who owns the brand, and who owns the system around the competition itself. Because the people who figured that out didn't just build a sports organization. They built one of the most unusual and powerful business machines in the history of American entertainment. And the lesson buried inside this story, it applies to almost every industry you can think of. Stay with me. Let's go back to 1993. A pay-per-view event aired on November 12th of that year with a simple, almost brutal premise. No weight classes, almost no rules. 8 fighters from different martial arts disciplines would compete in a single elimination tournament to answer one question. Which fighting style actually works? The event was called UFC 1. It was produced by a small media company called Semaphore Entertainment Group. It drew around 86,000 pay-per-view buys on its first night. For context, that was considered a modest number, but people watched, and they kept watching. By 1995, UFC pay-per-view buys were climbing toward 300,000 per event. That's real money, real audience interest. The product was rough, violent, and completely unregulated, and audiences were drawn to exactly that rawness. But then the walls closed in. Senator John McCain called the sport human cockfighting and launched a campaign to have it banned. By the late 1990s, UFC had been dropped from most major cable providers. It couldn't air in New York. It couldn't get mainstream sponsors. The parent company, Semaphore Entertainment Group, was bleeding money. The UFC brand, already toxic in the eyes of mainstream America, was collapsing. By 2001, the company was essentially finished. Semaphore was done. They needed out. And they were willing to sell for almost nothing. $2 million. That's what they accepted. Now, you probably think the two men who bought it were gamblers, dreamers, fans who got emotional about fighting. But here's what you don't know. They weren't fight fans buying a passion project. They were casino executives. They understood one thing above everything else: how to run a system where the house always wins. Their names were Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta. And what they bought wasn't a sports league. What they bought was a dormant platform with a loyal core audience, a recognizable brand, and, most importantly, zero competition. That distinction is going to matter enormously as this story develops. Hold on to it. The first thing the Fertitta brothers did was not market the product. The first thing they did was fix the legal problem. This is the part of the UFC story that almost never gets told. Before the money could flow, the business had to become legitimate. Lorenzo Fertitta had previously served on the Nevada State Athletic Commission. He understood the regulatory landscape from the inside. Along with Dana White, who was brought in as president, the new ownership group worked with the New Jersey State Athletic Control Board to develop what became known as the Unified Rules of Mixed Martial Arts, weight classes, round structures, a defined list of fouls, medical requirements, a legitimate competitive framework. This wasn't just ethics. This was business strategy. Because once the sport had rules, it could be regulated. And once it could be regulated, it could be licensed. And once it could be licensed, it could be televised. And once it could be televised, the entire economic model became possible. You cannot overstate how important this move was. It was the foundation everything else was built on. The Fertittas and Dana White didn't just buy UFC, they rebuilt the legal infrastructure around it so that the business could actually function at scale. But even after that, the money wasn't coming. Not yet. In those early years after the 2001 acquisition, the new owners reportedly lost somewhere in the range of $40 to $44 million trying to grow the organization. $44 million poured into something that still wasn't working. Most people would have stopped. Most investors would have walked away. They didn't. And the reason they didn't is going to tell you something critical about how great businesses are actually built. But first, I need to show you exactly how UFC makes its money, because the model itself is unlike anything else in American sports. And once you understand the structure, the rest of this story will make complete sense. You probably think UFC makes money the way the NFL or the NBA makes money. League fees, ticket sales, TV contracts split among teams, merchandise shared across franchises. That's not how this works. Not even close. Start with the most fundamental difference. In the NFL, there are 32 franchises. Each franchise is an independently owned business. The league is, in many ways, a joint venture among those franchise owners. Revenue gets distributed, television money gets shared, the power is distributed across the system. In the NBA, same structure. 30 teams, 30 ownership groups. The league negotiates collectively, and value flows outward to the franchises and their markets. UFC has none of that. There are no franchises. There are no team owners. There are no partner organizations sharing in the revenue. There is one promotion company. It owns everything. The brand, the events, the broadcast rights, the matchmaking decisions, the fighter contracts, the octagon itself. Every dollar that enters the UFC ecosystem flows through one entity. That's not how American sports leagues work. That's how a vertically integrated entertainment business works. Think less like the NFL and more like a Hollywood studio that also owns the movie theaters. And the revenue streams reflect that structure precisely. The first and most powerful stream is pay-per-view. UFC sells its premium events directly to consumers, historically through traditional PPV providers, and more recently through ESPN+, where fans pay to watch individual events on top of their subscription. A single major UFC event can generate between $50 and $100 million in pay-per-view revenue alone, depending on the card. The top events, the ones built around the right stars, can exceed that significantly. The second stream is media rights. In 2018, UFC signed a deal with ESPN, reportedly worth around $1.5 billion over 5 years. That's a guaranteed income floor, independent of any individual fight outcome. The partnership moved UFC's content to one of the most powerful sports media platforms in the country, and it gave ESPN Plus a marquee combat sports anchor to justify subscription growth. The third stream is live events. UFC charges premium ticket prices at venues around the world. A single event at Madison Square Garden or T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas can sell out arenas of 15 to 20,000 people, with floor seats sometimes reaching several $1,000s per ticket. Multiply that across dozens of events per year on a global calendar, and the live revenue becomes substantial. The fourth stream is sponsorship and partnership deals. Because UFC controls all event presentation, it controls all brand visibility at every event. The canvas of the octagon, the signage in the arena, the apparel worn by ring card holders. All of it is controlled and monetized centrally. No franchise negotiations, no team-by-team deals. One entity, one price, total control. And in a few minutes, I'll show you what all of those streams combined actually produced, and why the number that came out of it stunned even the most experienced deal makers in Hollywood. But first, let's talk about the engine that makes all of those streams possible, because none of this works without it. The engine is the star. This is perhaps the most underappreciated element of how UFC actually operates as a business. Unlike team sports, where a franchise's revenue is tied to the city it represents and the roster it assembles, UFC revenue is tied almost entirely to individual fighter narratives. The product being sold is not a team identity. The product being sold is a human being. Their story, their personality, their rivalries, their potential for spectacular success or spectacular failure. And UFC figured out earlier than almost anyone how to manufacture and amplify those narratives at scale. Consider what happened with Conor McGregor. By the time McGregor fought Nate Diaz at UFC 202 in August 2016, he had already become the most commercially valuable fighter in the organization's history. UFC 202 drew approximately 1.65 million pay-per-view buys, at the time the highest in UFC history. That one event, built almost entirely on the star power of one Irish fighter from Dublin who had been in the UFC for just a few years, generated roughly $140 million in pay-per-view revenue alone. But here's the thing about that number that most people miss. McGregor didn't build his own brand. UFC built it for him and around him. The promotional machine, the press tours, the produced content, the social media strategy, the scripted rivalries, the specific matchmaking decisions designed to amplify drama, all of it was controlled by UFC. McGregor brought charisma. UFC brought the amplification system. And that system could be pointed at the next fighter, and the next. Because the octagon doesn't retire, the platform doesn't age, the machine keeps running and new stars can always be fed into it. That is structurally impossible in a team league. You cannot replicate a star's entire brand infrastructure inside the NFL the same way, because the star plays for a franchise, answers to a franchise, and their economic value is split across a franchise system. In UFC, when the star performs, the promotion captures almost the entire economic upside. Which brings us to a number that, when you hear it, is going to completely reframe everything you've understood about this business so far. In 2016, 15 years after the Fertitta brothers paid $2 million for a failing, legally controversial, cable-dropped combat sports brand, they sold it. The sale price was $4 billion. $4 billion. 2,000 times their initial investment. Lorenzo Fertitta himself described it as the largest deal ever in the history of sports at that point. The buyers were WMEIMG, the Hollywood talent and entertainment conglomerate. These were not fight fans. These were some of the sharpest entertainment business minds in the world. And they paid $4 billion, which means they looked at UFC's structure, its media rights, its pay-per-view engine, its global growth trajectory, and concluded the number made sense. Think about that for a moment. The same product that U.S. senators tried to ban. The same company that lost $44 million in its early years after the 2001 acquisition. The same brand that couldn't get a cable deal in 2000, sold for $4 billion in 2016. But the story didn't stop there. In 2023, Endeavor, the parent company that had acquired UFC, completed a merger between UFC and WWE, the professional wrestling giant, to create a new publicly traded entity called TKO Group Holdings. The combined valuation of TKO at launch was approximately $21 billion. $21 billion. From $2 million to $21 billion in roughly 2 decades. Now, here's the question nobody seems to ask. Where did all of that value actually come from? Because if you've been watching carefully, you already sense the answer. But I want to make it explicit because it changes how you think about business entirely. The value didn't come from the fights. I know that sounds strange. But follow the logic. Fights happen everywhere. Boxing has been a professional sport for over a century. Wrestling has ancient roots. Kickboxing, judo, Brazilian jiu-jitsu. These arts existed long before UFC. The fighting itself, the human competition, the physical drama, none of that was invented by the Fertittas or Dana White. That was always there. What they built was the system around the fighting, the legal framework that made it regulatable, the promotional infrastructure that made individual fighters into global stars, the pay-per-view model that turned each event into a direct consumer transaction, the media rights structure that gave it a permanent, guaranteed revenue floor, the centralized contract system that kept all economic upside inside one entity rather than distributing it across franchises. They didn't sell fights. They sold a platform. And platforms, when they achieve control and scale, are worth billions. Here's what makes this a real lesson for anyone watching. You probably think the most important thing in business is having a great product, something people want, something exciting, something valuable. But look at what actually happened here. UFC's product, human beings fighting each other, was available in various forms long before UFC became dominant. Boxing existed. Pride FC in Japan was a legitimate global competitor in the early 2000s. Strikeforce ran professional MMA events. The product was not unique. What was unique was the system built around it, the control structure, the promotional model, the media relationships, the ability to take any talented fighter from anywhere in the world, run them through the UFC machine, and convert their talent into pay-per-view revenue and broadcast value. The lesson isn't find a great product. The lesson is find a product people want, then build the most powerful system of control and distribution around it that you possibly can. Because in the long run, it's not the product that gets valued, it's the platform. And UFC didn't just prove that in sports, they proved it in American business. But there is one more layer to this story, and this is the part that adds the real weight. With centralized control comes centralized power, and with centralized power comes a structural imbalance that has followed UFC through its entire rise. Fighter pay. In the NFL, players collectively bargain through a powerful union. The current NFL collective bargaining agreement guarantees players approximately 48% of league revenue. NBA players receive approximately 49 to 51% of basketball-related income. These numbers exist because team sports players organized, negotiated, and secured a formal share of the system they power. UFC fighters have no union. They sign individual contracts with a promotion that controls matchmaking, controls event presentation, and controls, to a significant degree, the trajectory of their careers. Independent studies and legal filings have estimated that UFC fighters collectively receive somewhere between 16 and 20% of revenue. In 2021, a class action antitrust lawsuit was filed by former UFC fighters, alleging that the organization's contracting practices suppressed fighter pay by limiting competition. The case moved forward through the federal court system for years, representing one of the most significant legal challenges to UFC's business model. This is not incidental to the story. It is structurally embedded in the story. The same centralized control that made UFC worth $4 billion and then $21 billion is the exact same mechanism that created this disparity. You cannot separate the business success from the power structure that enabled it. They are the same thing. The octagon is the product. The fighters are the labor. And the entity that owns the platform between them captures the majority of the value. That is the business model. In full, here is the final truth. When most people look at UFC, they see a fight promotion. They see Dana White on stage. They see two athletes in a cage. They see knockouts and championship belts. What they don't see is the architecture. They don't see a company that spent years rebuilding its legal legitimacy before it could scale. They don't see a promotional machine that manufactured global stars and then captured the financial upside of those stars completely. They don't see a pay-per-view revenue model that turned consumer demand into a direct income stream with almost no middlemen. They don't see a media rights deal that created a guaranteed income floor worth over $1 billion. They don't see a contract system that kept economic power concentrated rather than distributed. And they definitely don't see the quiet truth at the center of all of it, that UFC's most valuable asset was never a fighter. It was never a championship belt. It was never even the octagon. UFC's most valuable asset was always the fact that it owned everything around the fight. $2 million in 2001. $21 billion by 2023. Not because fighting got more popular. Not because people suddenly started loving violence more than they did before. Because someone looked at a broken, banned, radioactive brand and saw a platform waiting to be built. And then they built the system around it so tightly that nobody could compete with it without going through them. That is the real business of UFC, and now you cannot unsee it.